One thing about Trump is that he is something of a visionary. That doesn't mean that everything he envisions is a good idea.
Hi, I'm Maddie, Hale, and welcome to the Trump Report. Today we've spoken to John Roberts, a political strategist from Ronald Reagan's administration, as well as a political author. And we've spoken to him about the first 3 weeks of the Trump administration and how he compares to Ronald Reagan. There's always been comparisons between the two. We've spoken to him also about tariffs. Donald Trump has obviously said that he's implementing steel and aluminium tariffs and how this affects allies such as Australia, who's already hit back, and Prime Minister Anthony Albanese has called Donald Trump and said, no, we had a deal in place, so they might be exempt from these tariffs, along with just everything Donald Trump's been doing, what Doge has been uncovering, $59 million sent to housing illegal immigrants. All that and more on the Trump Report today. John Roberts, political strategist and political author, thank you so much for joining the Trump Report today.
Well, thank you, Maddie. It's my pleasure.
We've had a really busy 3 weeks, as I know that you've probably been locked in on what the Trump administration is doing. What has your reaction been to the first 3 weeks so far?
Well, it's been a real blitz. He's issued 500 executive orders. He's certainly doing what he said he would do during the campaign, which isn't something that always happens when politicians get into office. So it's been almost mind-boggling.
On Sunday, while Trump was flying to the Super Bowl, he had a group of reporters on Air Force One with him where he was signing various declarations. But when he was flying over the Gulf of Mexico, he officially signed the executive order changing the name of the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America. What did you make of that moment, that the president doing that?
Well, it's interesting symbolism. You know, the United States has, in the last couple of years, gone through renaming of a great many of its geographic features, national monuments, military bases, mainly for reasons of political correctness, to remove former Confederate generals' names from army bases, for example, or to take off the names of Western explorers from mountain peaks. And Trump has come in and he said, now we're going to rename Mount Denali Mount Kinley, and which it used to be known as for over 100 years, claiming the name of the Gulf of America for the Gulf of Mexico. I think is part of his symbolism of trying to assert that the United States is going to be more dominant in this hemisphere. That, of course, is part of his posturing to confront China's encroachment into the Western Hemisphere.
Donald Trump, he's still so adamant that the United States should acquire Greenland, despite the fact that Greenland and Denmark have pushed back, saying it's absolutely not for sale, and in different words told him to, F off, as well as the fact that he wants Canada to become the 51st state of the United States, saying that it's actually in the benefit of Canada, not only for various things, but including military. When you see a president making such outlandish remarks, how do you think the world and world leaders are viewing him right now?
Well, he's definitely shaking up the status quo. One thing about Trump is that he is something of a visionary. That doesn't mean that everything he envisions is a good idea, but nonetheless, he is a visionary. He looks at the world differently than in the terms of how we have treated it in the last 20, 50, or even hundreds of years. I don't think he's serious about taking Greenland, but I do think he's serious about highlighting the fact that Greenland is a strategically important territory in the race for the Arctic between the US, Russia, and China. This is now a multipolar world that we're living in. It's no longer a unipolar world, and the competition is going to be fierce moving ahead. The United States is a little late to this game, and Europe, I think, has not quite come to recognize what is really happening in the world today. And that is a realignment of forces in a way that points toward intense competition, both economically and possibly militarily. So Greenland at present is defended by Danish forces who in some cases need to move by dog sled to counter a potential threat.
I think that you've made an excellent point that whether he's serious or not, he's just stating various things, and that kind of brings me to my next point on tariffs, John. It's the main word that we've been hearing about for the last few weeks, him throwing around various threats to Canada, Mexico, and of course China, where the 10% threats are still very much in place. But then this week we've had him announce this global tariffs on steel and aluminium. And do you think that these threats of tariffs are effective, and do you think that he's going to continue using them on everything to get his point across?
It's an excellent question. I've been thinking about this since his initial announcement during the campaign that he intended to impose tariffs. Tariffs have an effect of raising consumer prices, which runs against one of the main things voters elected him for here in the United States, which was to control inflation and eventually bring prices down. In fact, in recent polling, that's the one area where consumers and Trump voters are not terribly happy with his job approval so far, or the job that he's done. Regarding tariffs themselves, the intellectual basis for what he's doing comes from a Harvard PhD, who is now the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors, Stephen Moran, who has postulated in a pretty sound economic theory paper that a 20% tariff would actually benefit the United States and eventually reset global trade in a way that is more advantageous to the US and even the European Union. Short run, it's going to cause tremendous turmoil. It's already caused a lot of business uncertainty. And the problem, I think, for Britain and the European Union will be that if China begins to lose easy access to markets in the US, it may begin dumping its surplus production on Europe and England. And especially when it comes to steel and aluminum, this could pose a major challenge to British steel. So I think that Europe needs to be ready to move with its own either quotas or reciprocal tariffs. And in a way, the big picture here is that for the last 25 years or so, the world has really been governed under the rules of the WTO in terms of trade. But before that, the world was governed by something called the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, GATT. And that was put in place in 1947 after World War II to regularize trade and allow Europe to develop after the devastation of that war and restore its industrial production and its economies. We may be moving back to a world of GATT, where everyone has some level of tariffs to try to manage trade rather than having the free trade agenda of the WTO. Again, Trump is a visionary. He shakes things up. He's making us look at the world differently. Short term, it'll be turmoil. Long term, will the results be what he anticipates? The jury's out.
If they even go ahead, John, that's, I think, the big question on everyone's lips. Will these go ahead? Are tariffs just a tool that Donald Trump uses to get his way? But I want to go into kind of how this affects global relationships. Now, these steel and aluminium tariffs will affect numerous countries, but Australia, my country, of course, was quick to jump in and basically say to Donald Trump, hey, we had a deal in place. Now, the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, called Donald Trump straight away and ended up getting to negotiate Donald Trump to reconsider and potentially exempt Australia from having to have this 25% tariff on steel and aluminium. But this was a similar negotiation that happened in 2018 between then President Donald Trump and then Prime Minister Malcolm Turnball. Now, Turnball ended up getting Trump to also exempt Australia from having to cough up this 25% tariff because it was going to cost the country a lot of money, and the United States and Australia are in a surplus. Now, Turnbull, in an interview this week, was asked about this because it's kind of Groundhog Day having to kind of negotiate this with Donald Trump again, and he called these tariffs economic nonsense and basically urged Australians not to judge Anthony Albanese if he's not able to get a deal over the line with Trump, because we're dealing with a more bullish president in 2025 than he was in 2018. So I want your thoughts on a former Prime Minister calling Donald Trump's tariffs economic nonsense, and the fact that he's gone and rebuked a previous deal with Australia that could impact a very strong, long-lasting relationship between a big ally?
Well, I think, bringing up 2018 was really a good thing to focus on, because the United States under Trump's first term did in fact carve out exemptions for a great many allies. And given that Trump is a negotiator and he governs by transaction, I think that we'll find exemptions to be fairly common when it comes to the application of the tariffs themselves. Regarding whether or not the whole tariff scheme is economic nonsense, there's probably a consensus of economists who agree with Mr. Turnball on that. It will remain to be seen whether any of these tariffs really stay in effect, other than the ones on China, I think, for the long term. Many of them, I think, Trump threatens to impose or imposes for a short period in order to negotiate some other point. And regarding the U.S.-Australia relationship, especially regarding the competition in the Pacific between the U.S. and China, Australia is a crucially important partner. And so it's very important that Trump take care to nurture our relationship with Australia. I mean, recently, the agreements between the two countries on defense have been extremely important. I know that Australia is looking forward to the acquisition of some submarines for its fleet that will be important to bolstering defense and deterring China in the Pacific. Well, I think that's the important thing that needs to be borne in mind here. And steel tariffs ought to be a secondary consideration when it comes to that relationship.
Moving on to Gaza, John, obviously another big topic from the last few weeks. We had Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu have that insane meeting in the White House to discuss their big proposal of basically the United States taking over the Gaza Strip, completely gutting it out, relocating Palestinians out of the Gaza Strip, 2 million Palestinians to be refugees, and then rebuilding it to become the Riviera of the Middle East. Now, it's another one of those outlandish comments that people still can't believe this is what the President of the United States is saying, but then he's gone on to Fox News with Brett Baer and he's called it a real estate development for the future. Now, as someone who's worked in a Republican administration, what do you make of things like this, comments from the president like this, calling the Gaza Strip a real estate development of the future?
There are several points, I think, to be made about this. One is that in some respects, what Trump was doing, again, in his over-the-top fashion, was reinforcing Netanyahu's standing with his own right wing. The right wing was not happy with the ceasefire, and of course Netanyahu's coalition government is fragile. They were not happy with the ceasefire. Some of them were pushing for total victory first. And there's a good chance that the war will resume in a short period of time after this initial first phase of the ceasefire. What to do with the Gazans afterward is, of course, a huge question here. Do we resettle them in tent cities for the length of time that it will take to rebuild? The proposal to resettle the Gazans temporarily or permanently elsewhere, in Egypt or in Jordan, for example. The King of Jordan is in Washington today talking with Trump about this. Jordan's not eager to take more Palestinians in, nor is Egypt. Could you redevelop the Gaza Strip to be the Dubai of the future? With enough money, possibly so, but I don't think the question of resettling the Palestinians is going to be an easy one. I think the Gazans, for the most part, will want to remain in their homeland.
John, this weekend will be the Munich Security Conference, and JD Vance will be attending that. It was reported by The Guardian that there'd been a pre-summer report that stated that the United States was no longer the anchor of stability that it once was. With so much happening in the last 3 weeks of Trump's presidency, does that declaration make sense to you as an American?
Well, I think the Munich conference is going to be an interesting event. It may be a turning point for Europe. And I think that the conference planners themselves are aware of this in their preliminary report, before the conference takes place. They pointed out that the European Union went in for hyper-globalization after the end of the Cold War, more so even than the United States in terms of trade and economic linkages, offshoring of industry. And I think that, we're at a point where that is an issue that is both through tariffs and through economic nationalism, forefront. And the other part, of course, is who will pay for European security. Trump has talked about 5% being the minimum that NATO members should contribute to national security and international cooperation through NATO. Few European countries at the moment have hit their 2% mark. So we're talking about a more than doubling of their defense contribution. And I noted that in the preliminary conference report, one of the things that is stated is that this may be the turning point where Europe, the EU, begins to take responsibility for its own defense. So I think that the leak, if you will, that the U.S. may no longer be the anchor of European security is intended to be a message, a signal that Europe should now seriously find a way to increase its defense spending. That's a very tall order given the tumultuous condition of European politics.
John, speaking about spending, government spending for one, we've got Elon Musk kind of on a warpath, cutting down government spending. Controversially, we saw last week USAID was one of the first to go, and then now the ex-owner has said that FEMA sent $59 million, which included $19 million to house illegal migrants in hotels in New York City. This was kind of coupled with the fact that FEMA had declared last year that they didn't really have enough funds when it came to helping out victims of Hurricane Helene. Musk has basically said that FEMA should be designated just for American disaster relief. What did you make of this find from Elon Musk, kind of uncovering how much money had been spent from FEMA in this particular era, which is not really meant to be spent on border security and anything to do with illegal migration?
What happened was about $650 million was reallocated from border enforcement to sheltering migrants across the U.S. in cities big and small, but mainly in large municipal areas. I am not surprised that some employees at FEMA would have shuttled more money out the door in a 1-week period, trying to do what the Biden White House has been doing ever since the election. And that is taking funds which were available and dispersing them as quickly as possible in order to prevent Trump from stopping those monies from flowing. I read a report this morning that says that 4 FEMA employees have now been fired owing to the fact that this transfer was made. And I'm sure that as we dig into the details of our multi-trillion-dollar budget, we'll find many more areas where 50, 60, 100 million, $500 million went out the door at the last minute in ways that may not have been very wise.
Yeah. But even with all that and the fact that Elon Musk doesn't seem to be stopping anytime soon, his appointment as the head of DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, has been met with controversy. People say, well, he's got no government background, he doesn't have expertise in this area, he shouldn't have access to the federal payment system, so much so that several Democrats have written to Trump's chief of staff, Susie Wiles, and said that he's a conflict of interest, and then saying he jeopardizes national security. What do you make of Elon Musk's role in this, John? Because it's a very unprecedented situation we're in, having the head of X, formerly Twitter, and Tesla in charge of basically cutting down government spending, access to all of the federal agencies that the government is in charge of. Was this a good move from Donald Trump, or does it really look like he doesn't know what he's doing here?
It's an interesting move. In the Reagan administration, one of the parallels that existed is something called the Grace Commission. And what Reagan did was he pulled together a commission of businessmen from across a range of industries. And he asked them to identify ways to cut government regulations and to cut government spending. The Grace Commission took pretty much about a year to finish its report and then submitted it to the White House. And then the president had the Office of Management and Budget implement what it could, as well as other federal agencies. And some of the things had to go through Congress and the regulatory process. What Trump has done is put that on steroids by having Elon Musk become a special government employee and then authorizing him and his team to go through the federal government personally, going right into the offices where many of these programs are administered or where the spending is taking place, and asking for access to the computer systems and other data in order to try to identify waste and fraud. I think the goal is good. I'm not sure that the means of doing it, which is shock and awe, basically, is the best. And I think there are some legitimate questions and concerns about the extent to which certain data sets should be accessed and who should have access to them. Some of this falls within the legitimate power of the president. Some of it may be governed by existing law, like our Privacy Act laws in the United States. And I think ultimately the courts are going to have to decide where are the limits of presidential power in this case. That's the American system at work. One branch or another may push its prerogatives. The other branch, our three executive branches, three federal branches, the executive power, the legislative, and the judiciary, constantly are readjusting the boundaries of power in our system. That's the way it's designed to work. And I think ultimately the courts will have a say in how much of Elon Musk's presidentially endowed powers are proper.
John, on the note of what you were talking about at the beginning of that question, and a final question for you is, do you see similarities between Donald Trump and Ronald Reagan? We know that everyone considers the Reagan era the heyday of the Republican Party, and some would argue that it's kind of coming back to that with Donald Trump. But what do you think, as someone that's obviously studied both presidents closely?
A lot of my friends who worked in the Reagan administration are very offended by any analogy between Trump and Reagan. On the other hand, one of our top historians in the country, Max Boot, who has a column in the Washington Post, wrote a biography on Reagan that was released last year. And when he was writing it, he got in touch with me, and I shared a lot of the papers that I have regarding the Reagan presidency with him. He was not sure how he viewed the relationship between Trump and Reagan. In the end, in this new biography of Reagan, he came to the conclusion that Reagan was in many ways a precursor of Trump and more like Trump than we think. So Max has gone out on a limb with that. I mean, as I say, many Reagan people are very offended by that notion. But I do see similarities. I also see very substantial differences, mainly in style, but I think also somewhat in personality. I mean, Reagan was anything but a brash character. And I think Donald Trump relishes in the fact that he is a brash personality. He's the kind of guy who comes into the room and shakes things up. And Reagan was, to use a phrase that's not often applied to American presidents, much more courtly.
John Roberts, thank you so much for your time today.
Well, thank you, Maddie. It's been, as I say, it's been a pleasure, and we'll all stay tuned because these are fascinating times we're living in.